Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Canaan STL Podcast, brought to you by Canaan Baptist Church, where we exist to connect you to what matters most, to God, to people, and to purpose. Hey, this is Pastor Daniel, and again today I'm joined by Pastor Martin Winslow. How you doing today, Martin?
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Well, you know, we start a new day today for, I don't know, how many weeks? 9, 10 weeks? We were on eschatology.
Yeah, probably too many.
Yeah, well, you know, and it's still applicable. The end has not happened yet, right? Because we're still here. Jesus hasn't come yet. But anyway, we're moving on today. Today begins kind of a new, probably shorter series, and we're going to be talking about ecclesiology. So what is ecclesiology? What is that?
Ecclesiology just means anytime you hear ology on the back side of a word, soteriology, theology, whatever, it just means
biology,
geology.
geology.
Yeah. It's the study of, right?
Whatever comes first.
And whatever comes first. And in this case, ecclesiology would be the study of the church.
Yes, the study of the church. What is the church? Who is she? What's her purpose? You know, and all of those are great things to talk about. You can get into a lot of different issues like what is church membership? What is church discipline? But we're going to focus on, at least at the beginning of this series, we're going to focus on the structure and what's called polity. So another big word there. What is polity?
Yeah, polity has to do with the setup then of the church. So if we're talking about ecclesiology and then we say, well, the aspect of polity within the church, it's going to be the structure. How is it set up? Who are the leaders?
Yes. How are decisions made?
How are decisions made? How does that relate to the lay people? And then what do the lay people do and those kind of things?
Yeah, that's right. It's good. So we're going to kind of just jump right in with looking at the issue of polity. You know, you look across the church landscape, especially, well, even including Catholic and Protestant, you see a lot of different types of polity. And really, every one of these, for the most part, has some, at least, biblical support, biblical merit. So let's just look at some of the three big ones, right? The first one is what's called the episcopal polity. So why don't you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so the episcopal polity comes from the Greek word episkopos.
Yes.
And so when we look at their polity, it has a very top-down approach, whereas in Baptist life we might say we're more congregational. In the Episcopal type of scheme, you have leadership from the top that make most of your decisions. Move pastors into certain parishes and certain areas of ministry where it's not necessarily like a vote like you might see in Baptist life, where somebody comes and they preach, they come in view of a call. It's not done like that, bottom up, but it's the opposite. It's
and so, you know, in Scripture, we see the word episkopos used quite a bit. 1 Timothy chapter 3, where Paul says, if anyone aspires to the office of episkopos, which, you know, most English translations today would translate that overseer.
Yeah, right.
But some of the older translations translate it as bishop.
Right.
So that's where our concept of bishop comes from. And so the episcopal polity is really derived of that concept of bishop. There's one person who kind of oversees the church.
Right.
And so here we would see the Catholic Church. That would definitely be an episcopal polity, you know, all the way up to the Pope, right? You mentioned top down. I mean, how much more top down does it get than the papacy, right? So the bishop in the Catholic Church actually is the church in their thought and process. The bishop owns the property. The bishop appoints priests and pastors and sends them wherever he sees fit.
Right.
And so there's
regardless of what the congregation thinks.
Yeah, the congregation has no say-so in that.
Yeah, no voting.
At least under most Catholic systems.
Yeah.
I think this is all true for the Episcopal Church too, as well as the Anglican Church. All of those are of the Episcopal polity. And so that word is derived from, like you said, the episkopos. And so here's what's interesting. Maybe we need to kind of bring this into, let's look at a couple of passages where these different roles, because the next one we're going to look at is the Presbyterian model, which comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which translates as elder. All right, so but let's read a few passages here that kind of contain the word episkopos and kind of contain the word presbyteros, and finally will contain the word poimen in Greek, which we translate pastor or shepherd.
Right.
So a lot of these verses have all of those words used interchangeably.
Right.
So one's in 1 Peter
Yep.
chapter 5. So Morton, you got that? You're just going to read 1 Peter chapter 5 and see how Peter uses these terms. And when you get to those terms, I'll interrupt you and we'll talk about them.
Okay. So 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1 says, I exhort the elders among you.
All right, there's the elders. That's the word presbyteros.
Right.
Okay?
Right. And like you said, the word Presbyterian's derived from
That's
that,
right.
which we'll
Yep.
unpack later. So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder and witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as one who shares in the glory about to be revealed. Shepherd God's flock among you.
Okay, right there. The word shepherd is the verb form of the Greek word poimen, which is translated pastor or shepherd. So here, what Peter is saying, he's talking to the elders, but commands them to shepherd, to
right.
pastor. All right? Yeah, keep going.
Verse 2 again, shepherd God's flock among you, not overseeing out of compulsion, but willingly.
There you go. Overseeing. It's the verb form of the word episkopos.
Right.
So there we see all bundled together is this concept that elders, presbyteros, are to shepherd, pastor, and to oversee, episkopos. So all three of these terms here, Peter uses all together, talking to the same group of leaders.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Now we're going to go to Acts chapter 20, where we're going to see Paul essentially do the same thing. So Acts chapter 20, Paul is addressing the church at Ephesus. And it says, verse 17, it says, from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and called the elders of the church to come to him. So there you go. Again, the Greek word is presbyteros, which again translates as elders. And then we go on down, and you get to verse 28, and he says, pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. There we go, overseers, episkopos. To care for, and that word to care for is to shepherd. It's the same as the Greek word poimen, to care for, to pastor the church of God, which he obtained with his blood. So interestingly there's two passages, two different apostles, and I don't know, probably most people would say there's kind of the top two, Peter and Paul, right? And they are both using all three of these terms almost as though they're synonymous. Yeah, the same guys, the same group of leaders. And so out of this, the church throughout the centuries has had to unpack, well, how do we structure based on this concept of elders, pastors, bishops, or overseers? What does that look like? Well, the Episcopal model says, well, the bishop is one guy over a certain area of churches, and he calls the shots. Now, the Presbyterian model is a little different. So in the Presbyterian model, you see the word elder. So Titus chapter 1 is very interesting because here Paul is addressing Titus, and he kind of goes through the same teaching he did to Timothy, except here he doesn't use the word episkopos. In Timothy, he said, anyone who aspires to the office of overseer or episkopos. Right. But here he tells Titus, he says, this is why I left you in Crete, you might put what remained in order and appoint elders, that's the word presbyteros, in every town as I directed you. And then he goes in and he lists these qualifications for the elder, which are nearly identical to the same qualifications the same author, Paul, used in 1 Timothy 3 for bishops or overseers. Right. So another strong argument, these are really synonymous. Yeah. But the Presbyterian model of government, as in the Presbyterian church, is set up a little differently than the bishop, where the bishop is one guy over a whole area. The presbytery is a group of men, of elders, who oversee several Presbyterian churches. Yeah. So in the Presbyterian model, again, how much say-so does the congregation have?
Yeah, they don't have any.
Very little. They might be able to nominate men for elders, but that's their only voice.
Or maybe appeal something through a local elder that might be in. But in general, the Presbyterian model is very top down as well.
It is. Yeah. It is. It's just where there's a group of men, not just one
rather
guy.
Than one.
There's not a CEO. It's more like a board of shepherds, board of directors, so to speak. Yep. And then the third, probably most common polity is one that's been historically Baptist, and that is the congregational model, which really looks at this word pastor, shepherd, shepherds the flock, right? But you look at Acts chapter 6, and you see a little bit of indication that the church does have a voice.
Yeah.
The congregation has a voice. And so what happens in Acts chapter 6?
Yeah, in Acts chapter 6, there's a lot going on in the early church. There's a need for people to be served. There are these widows within the church that need help, and the disciples are just really kind of overwhelmed, the leadership. And so what happens is the apostles come together and they pray and they lay their hands on certain men and they bring them before the church. And the church then makes the decision, really, and a lot of people argue about this, but it's at least the prototype for deacons being appointed in the church. So the body has something to really say about
that's right.
that.
That's right. And you see that Acts chapter 6, it said, and so the church chose the 7, right? And it pleased the church, right? You also see Acts 15, where there's this big kind of argument going on, a big debate in the church on how do Jewish Christians coexist in the same church with Gentile Christians because their culture's so different. Right. And anyway, James, the half brother of Jesus, makes a recommendation, and it simply says that in the saying pleased the whole church. So there was some mechanism in place for the congregation to affirm that decision. And so we see some aspects of congregationalism. So putting all three of those together, let's look at what are the negatives of the Episcopal model? What's some flags, red flags, yellow flags, look out for with the bishop type polity?
Well, I think just in general, if you're looking at it from a 30,000 foot view, you're looking down on it and you're going to say that's too much power for one person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And power corrupts, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
Yep.
And so what can happen is cover-ups, not being open about certain things. You get the wrong, it's kind of like having a monarch, right? You get a good monarch, everything's fine.
Yeah, that's right.
You get a bad one, things go really bad.
That's right. And that's definitely a downfall. I mean, we're all sinners,
That's
so
right.
if you look at the history of the Roman Catholic Church, which that's their polity, with the Pope down. There's been several popes throughout history who were just extremely corrupt, especially in those Middle Ages. They were just power hungry, and it became extremely political. I mean, we think Republicans and Democrats are at each other's throats today. Yeah, should read some history about some of those popes being, it's just, it's intense. So you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak. And if that man's not a man of character, it's big trouble. And even if that man is a man of character, he's still a sinner. He's still flawed. And so temptation will come. And like you quoted earlier, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's just a ticking time bomb for one man to do that. So that would definitely be one of the strongest marks against an Episcopal model of polity, right?
And too, I think this just kind of like as a side note to that same idea is, and we would all affirm this, even a person in that polity would affirm it, but Christ is the head of the church.
That's right. Absolutely.
Right? And so if you don't remember that you're an under shepherd, what can tend to happen in that model is the elevation of a person, a personality, whatever, and it becomes corrupted.
Of course, in the Catholic Church, they even go so far as to say that the Pope is the vicar of Christ.
Exactly.
He is Christ's mouthpiece to the church. And so
how dangerous is that?
It really gets dicey. That's very dicey. Yeah. So that's definitely what do you think would be, though, just to be fair, what do you think is a pro for the Episcopal model?
Well, I think can be a pro because at the same time, if the monarch or the person in control in that situation is overseeing justly and rightly, regardless of the direction the congregation goes, or let's say the culture begins to move the congregation, you can't make an ad populum argument that, well, there's 1,000 people over here and they believe this way, it must be the right way. So taking control away from the congregation, if you had a monarch who stuck with what God says, that could be a pro in swimming against the tide, because sometimes the majority are wrong. Yeah. Right?
That's right.
And so that could be, I guess, a plus in that situation.
Yep, absolutely.
Although an unpopular plus.
It is an unpopular plus. But, also I would see not only the ability to make a right decision regardless of what the majority says or thinks, also the ability to act quickly to make that decision and implement. Yeah. So there was a few pluses, just to be fair. Yeah. But definitely in my mind, that negative far outweighs any positive. I don't think Of course, I'm not Episcopal or Catholic or Anglican, but I just don't think that polity is healthy or safe in the hands of fallen mankind. What about the Presbyterian model? What negatives do you see with the Presbyterian model of polity?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think the fall of those two models, like you had actually mentioned whenever we look at Baptist polity, and I think it's correct, is the congregation has to have some power. We see that with church discipline. If you look at Matthew 18, right, there's a process for church discipline.
Absolutely.
Things end up before the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it's a church decision. When somebody makes, a sinful decision that is not dealt with, it has to come before the church. So there are these certain situations, and in the Presbyterian kind of mindset, the presbytery, they can mainly control those decisions without having to listen.
I don't know 100%, but I'm 90% sure that in the Presbyterian church, if there are church discipline issues, the person being disciplined comes before the elders, not the congregation,
not the body.
Yeah. Okay. So in that sense, it really equates the elders as the church, which I don't agree with that.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm not Presbyterian, but that's we agree with a lot of our Presbyterian brothers and sisters, but that would be kind of one area. This polity issue would be one issue I would just defer a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you think, I think too, one of the crux of those two polities, right, is one takes the word from Titus chapter 1 on elders, and that's the presbyteros word.
Yep.
The other, the Episcopal form, gets it from 1 Timothy chapter 3, where it says overseer, which is the other word, episkopos. And we would look at those as the same thing.
Absolutely. It's one and the same.
The exact same thing.
Yeah.
And so they create these offices and these structures based on what we would feel like, I think, is a misunderstanding of the text, which is that's one office.
Yeah. It's one office. It's the one and the same.
It's the same.
That's right.
Yeah.
And we would also equate that with the role of pastor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because again, back to 1 Peter 5, Acts chapter 20, all three terms are used to refer to the same person or persons, right?
Yep.
Which leads us to the last polity option, which is what we as Baptists hold to, and that's congregationalism, where the ultimate say so. Of course, Christ is the head of the church. He's the head in all three polities. In the congregational model, Christ is the head, but the ultimate say-so and determining factor of where Christ is leading us is the church.
That's right. That's right.
So again, we talked about Acts 6, Acts 15 is biblical precedents for those, church folk. But so here we get into where there's some freedom.
Yeah, right.
Congregationalism. What should the entire church vote on? What should be their say-so, right?
Yeah, and I think everybody has a little bit different.
Yeah, every church is different.
Even within Baptist life, right?
Yeah.
There's different views of what that polity looks like. I think, though, I've heard you say this before, and I'm in total agreement. If you're just looking at the structure and generalities, right? So you create a big tent. Underneath that tent, there's a little bit of understanding that might be different about how this would work out. But in general, congregational ruled, elder led, deacon served. That's kind of how we look at things in our structure.
Yeah, that's right.
So the final say-so on big matters, and we can talk about that, get in the weeds about what we feel like are those kind of issues here at our church in particular.
Yeah.
But in generalities, as it relates to the big things, the church needs to have a say in those things.
Yeah.
That's just kind of
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
And that's to prevent, abuse by the leadership, those kind of things. And for us to just be humble enough to be called to the carpet on things and be able to give a good answer, a biblical answer for why we're heading in a direction.
Yeah. One of the negatives about Presbyterian, which is not nearly as strong of a negative as it for the Episcopal, but is those elders, there really is, although they can have some accountability internally among themselves, there's really no agency that holds that group accountable. Right. And, we kind of have seen that in of course, the Presbyterian church in the last 15, 20 years has suffered a terrible split over primarily issues with liberalism, LGBTQ plus agenda, et cetera. And so you have the Presbyterian USA, which is definitely your liberal group. And then you have your Presbyterian Church of America, or PCA, which is your conservative group. And those churches split, right?
Yeah.
And it was really those elders at the presbytery level that made those decisions, which direction they're going. And so, we're not Presbyterian, not on the inside of those discussions, debates, et cetera, but I wonder what it looked like in a given church. I'm sure there was a case where the presbytery said, we're going to go Presbyterian USA liberal, but one of those congregations might have said, well, we don't want to do that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
that happened.
Yeah. But because they weren't in charge, they had to follow the Presbyterian or the presbytery's direction and were forced to go against conscience, or hopefully they left that
they
church
picked up and left
and went to a PCA church, right?
Right.
So, but that's a real dilemma, negative I see in that there's just a lack of accountability for the group.
Right.
Again, there's going to be more accountability within the group there is in the individual, so it's better. But then we come to congregationalism, and so there is an underlying assumption in congregationalism that I think we have to just vocalize to be fair. And that is that the assumption is in congregationalism that every member of the church is truly born again, is filled with the Spirit of God, and is therefore making decisions and casting vote based on what the Holy Spirit is desiring and leading that church to do. There's a lot of assumptions in that.
Yeah.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to recognize, right? I mean, and Jesus warns us of this, even in Matthew chapter 24, 3 different times. There's wolves in sheep's clothing.
Yeah,
and wheat and tares grow up together sometimes. And so we cannot, and we've seen this before, Daniel, we talked about it. You can't underestimate this idea that the devil could be planting seeds of corruption among you to bring disunity within the body.
That's right.
Right. And so we've got to remember that we're in a spiritual battle, and there could be those plants by the enemy to actually destroy unity and moving forward on certain things that might be God's will.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
So the argument that, everybody gets a vote is better may not necessarily be true.
That's right. And so that's one deal, is that Satan can plant wolves in sheep clothing. Another issue is you might just have people who just aren't saved in the membership. I don't know where. I've always wondered this, and I've tried to find it, and I can't. But I remember always hearing that Billy Graham's ministry always said that at least 60% of the membership of any given evangelical church is not really saved. I don't know where he got that.
Yeah.
That's scary to me.
Yeah, right.
Well, that would mean, though, that you would have 60% of any given congregational church that's not voting with the Holy Spirit, is voting out of their flesh or out of their own personal desires and preferences. Yeah. And that's really dangerous. Yeah. That is the danger of congregationalism.
Yep. Absolutely.
And you look biblically. I mean, in Scripture, how often is the majority right? Yeah. I mean, that's scary.
Exactly. Well, in the congregational structure, right, a lot of times you can see this, and we've seen this before, just in different meetings and things like this in Baptist life through the years. Fortunately, we've got an incredible church family, and I've not witnessed this, but every once in a while, you've got a couple people who are super duper loud that can also sway.
Yeah.
Right? A group to move in a certain direction, even though they may have been with this leadership moving in a certain direction and the pastors. You might have these people feeling like, because we're congregational, that makes everybody's vote exactly equal across the board, and those loud people get listened to.
Yeah, that's right. You look at the Old Testament, and as Moses and Aaron were leading the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt, right? I mean, if majority won, they'd have gone back to Egypt at least 3 times.
Absolutely.
Yep. I mean, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
So we gotta just be fair and say one of the major negatives of congregationalism is it does assume every member is truly born again and is not voting in the flesh or not voting their personal preferences, but is voting in accordance to the Spirit of God. Yeah. Because the Spirit of God is not going to tell you one thing and me something different.
Right.
And so if we're having a divisive vote, then somebody's not being led by the Spirit of God, so that there it gets a little treacherous, right? Sure. So just to conclude today, and then we'll kind of tell you where we're going to go with this, but, the view thing, we believe, and I say we, it's Martin and I and other leaders here at Canaan, that a hybrid is the most biblical model. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it, congregational ruled, which means the big issues are to be voted on by the church family, but to be elder led. Again, elder is bishop, is overseer, it's elder, it's pastor, kind of one. It's all the same office, and it's always plural when talking about the group that leads a church. So a plurality of these, and we'll unpack these in future weeks, but in a plurality of these elders, pastors, overseers to lead the church. But the church is congregational ruled, elder led, and then deacon served. Yeah. So why are we talking about this right now? That's the big question is why the timing on this polity discussion? Well, there's a lot of great things happening at Canaan where we have been part of our vision is to become start new campuses, become multi-site. And in the meantime, we've also had 2 churches come to us wanting us to adopt them and make them into Canaan campuses. Yeah. And so we're in conversation with those right now. So we have to, by necessity, amend their structure a little bit. We have to flex our structure some. And so we've just been having the conversation as leaders, both paid staff and also several leaders in our church family who aren't paid staff, deacons and committee chairs and that sort of thing. So we're in the process of now unpacking to the church family what we believe that flex should look like. And it's a combination. But we're looking to be congregational ruled where we have very well-defined items that the whole church family votes on.
Sure.
And it's the big ones, right? But then we also are going to have elders, not just our paid team, but also a lot of what we would call lay elders, which means non-paid staff to help lead the church as we go multi-site, but then be deacon served. And so and next week, we'll begin to unpack all of that, the whys, the practicals, and also some more of the biblical support for it. But this is a timely conversation. We've been having it for a little bit. We just did a series on 1 Timothy, be the church. And that was all part of this process that we're really taking our time. We want to be very deliberate. We want to communicate well so that everyone knows what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where it ends up. And so that's the goal. But if you have any questions or comments, feel free to send them to us at info@canaanstl.org. And we'll talk to you next time on the Canaan STL podcast.